When we first married, Jackson was the primary person in my life to push me to try new things. Bungee jumping, tours to the Grand Canyon, monster truck shows. I mean, he really was just wild when it came to activities. The same was true when it came to food. I'm pretty sure that in our 5.5 years in this town, we've been to every restaurant here. Thai, Indian, and even some Scandinavian place that's pretty out of the way. He's a free spirit, and I love him for it. But there's always been one thing constant in our relationship. He's not a huge fan of spaghetti. I remember I invited him over to my place when we were still dating. I'd offered to cook, and he sounded excited, saying that nothing I cook could possibly taste bad, and stuff like that. But as soon as he entered the kitchen and saw the spaghetti on the table, I saw his face fall slightly. He still ate it, but I could tell he wasn't into it. I was beating myself up about it at first, but I found that no matter who cooked it, or no matter how good the presentation was, he just never cared for spaghetti. It wasn't a vehement hatred. He always said, "If you have squid ink pizza and spaghetti set in front of me, I'll probably eat the squid ink pizza first." And it's always been true until recently. We made it a tradition to eat at every new restaurant that opens in our town. So when Spaghetti Teddy's opened on Main, I spent days bugging him about it. It wasn't until I reminded him of his Google review streak that we finally went. It was your typical Italian-American restaurant. Pictures of rosy-cheeked chefs on the wall, those red and green plastic cups, and tablecloths that were somehow sticky despite the restaurant being new. Jackson grabbed one of the menus, and I saw his face screw up. As the restaurant's name implied, spaghetti was the only thing on the menu. I ordered a standard spaghetti and meatballs for the both of us, and watched with unwavering amusement at Jackson's waning enthusiasm. The food was finally set down in front of us, and I pursed my lips. Mediocre. Looks like this one's another dud, huh? I said after the first bite. Jackson didn't say anything, and I looked up at him. He was crying. Like actually crying. His shoulders were shaking and he was sniffling. And he looked up at me while tears streamed down his cheeks. "Mikey," he began. "This is what I've been looking for," he said, wiping his cheeks with his sleeve. "For my entire life," he said. Then he let out a sob that startled me. I stood up from my seat and placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off and continued to shovel forkfuls of lukewarm pasta and bland sauce into his mouth. I sat back in my seat and watched in awe. He didn't say another word on our drive back home. I asked if he was okay as he climbed into bed. He just stared at me for a few minutes before smiling and saying, "I've never been better, Mikey." The next day was Saturday, and I woke up to find that Jackson had gotten up before me. It was rare that he ever did, since he wasn't a morning person, and I came downstairs to find him at his laptop. "You're up early," I said, and Jackson didn't respond. His brows were furrowed as he scrutinized whatever was on his screen. I moved into the kitchen and asked him, "What are you feeling for breakfast?" I asked, grabbing a coffee filter from the cabinet. He started, finger moving over the mouse wheel rapidly. "I'm good actually, honey. Thanks though," he said. He stayed rooted to the computer chair all day, and didn't get up until dinner rolled around. He stood up from his laptop and grabbed his keys from the tray on the counter. "I'm heading out to Teddy's," he said and closed the door. I didn't pick my jaw up from the floor until I heard the car pulling out of the driveway and moving down the street. It continued like this for a while and became more frequent too. Jackson would spend hours on the computer after work, and all day on it during the weekends. He never went on walks or offered to take me to some obscure bagpipe concert he found online or anything. He ate spaghetti teddies at least one meal every day, and oddly, stopped going to the bathroom as often as he should. He started wearing the strainer on his head a month or so after our first visit there. I thought he was just joking at first, but then he didn't stop wearing it. He just walked out the door with it one day for work, and I had to do a double take. I ran out the door after him and told him that he'd forgotten to take the strainer off. He smiled at me over the top of the car and said, "I'm not afraid of what other people think, Mikey," and got into his car and left while I stood bug-eyed on our front porch. It kept getting worse over the next few months. Eventually, Jackson wouldn't eat anything but spaghetti teddies, and around town I started seeing them, people with strainers on their heads. Spaghetti teddies got more and more popular, to the point where the line would be out the door and onto the street. Because of this, it meant Jackson would spend hours waiting in line multiple times a day for mediocre, lukewarm spaghetti. I know what you're thinking, but I honestly couldn't do anything to stop him. I tried convincing him to eat something, anything but teddies, but he just pushed it away. One night, when Jackson was down on another pasta coma, I snuck downstairs to his laptop. I've never been one to invade his privacy, but I can't bear to see him go like this. I opened his laptop only to be met with a locked screen. He'd never needed one before. Always the "I got nothing to hide" kind of guy. I swallowed and tried my name, then my birthday, then his birthday. I typed in Teddy's for the last attempt, and sure enough, it worked. His desktop was just filled with folders and documents, and his search history wasn't any better. Words like Pastafarianism and Flying Spaghetti Monster were littered throughout his history. He'd been on forums talking with other people who'd found the light and were looking to disentangle themselves. I looked at the documents spread across his desktop, and it was more of the same. Manifestos and hymns all to this spaghetti monster. I shut his laptop and tried to stay quiet as I climbed back upstairs to bed. Jackson was still sound asleep, but I was wide awake for the rest of the night. I noticed his stomach when he got into bed the other night. It was bloated and bulging, and he got into bed with a wince. Then it hit me. "Honey," I started, placing a hand on his thigh. "When was the last time you used the bathroom?" I asked tentatively. Jackson just shook his head. "I can't do that, Mikey," he said. "My body is a temple, and I need to ensure it remains full and pure," he said. I shot him a look. "Jackson, no. Get up and go use the restroom now. This isn't good for you," I said, feeling like I was scolding a child. He shook his head. "Didn't you hear what I said, Michael?" he said, using my full name, something he only did when he was irritated. "This temple. I cannot taint it," he stated. I blinked at him and looked into his eyes, searching for signs of joy, but all I found was cold determination. I nodded slowly and turned. Time drug on slowly after that. and I watched as Jackson grew sicker and sicker with each passing day. Jackson had been withdrawn before, but soon he'd stop talking to me completely. And I swear I could hear him muttering words like heretic and false worshipper under his breath. He stopped going to work and spent most of his day on his laptop or at Teddy's. He'd started sleeping on the couch too. Last night, I decided that I'd had enough. I went downstairs to Jackson to find him at his usual station in front of his laptop. I stood next to him for a moment before shutting it on whatever he was typing. He looked down at it for a while, then looked at me. I'd never seen him like this before. He stood abruptly and I took a step back. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, drawing closer, and I struggled for an answer. "You're not yourself anymore," I said as I backed past the staircase into the kitchen. Jackson smiled with all his teeth and said, "I've never been more myself. Hell, more alive than I have been these past few months," he said. He crossed into the beam of the kitchen light, and I saw him for what felt like the first time in a while. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot. The strainer on his head was covering his matted, unwashed hair, and his stomach was bulging in a way that looked painful and just wrong. I felt tears well up in my eyes as his smile dropped into a scowl. "I'm about to be reborn. We all are," he said, spreading his arms out at his sides. "And you heretics will live in our world or perish," he yelled. What happened next happened lightning fast and slow at the same time. I saw something in Jackson's stomach shift, and he pitched forward. The strainer on his head clattered to the ground, and he let out a howl of pain. I gathered myself from my fear and ran to his side, but he pushed me back with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I watched as he writhed on the ground, his groans of agony turning into laughs of ecstasy as his stomach pulsed and burst. Ropes of pasta, blood, and intestines splattered across the floor. He continued laughing, then heaved as more pasta shot forth from his mouth. I stood horrified and grieved as my husband's limbs stretched, brown skin turning into a pale yellow. He looked at me one last time, and for a moment I saw him, the man that I married, the Jackson that loved everyone and wanted to try everything. But then, the light died in his eyes, and he was reduced to nothing but a pile of pasta and gore. I burst through my front door at the same time as one of my neighbors. She was a teenager, no older than 16. She screamed at something in her doorframe, then flinched as she was covered in stringy bits of blood and pasta. Behind me, a wet slithering caught my attention. Whatever was left of Jackson's corpse was alive, and it was coming for me. I looked back to the girl only to find her struggling on the ground, tendrils of pasta coming to wrap around her neck. The tendrils behind me pulsed and lunged, and I jumped out of the way. I leapt over them back into the house to get my keys, and nearly tripped as I ran back off the porch to the car. I got in and started it, my bare feet pushing down on the gas pedal as I peeled out of the driveway and away from my home. It was chaos outside, people clutching their stomachs and bursting from the inside out, masses of pasta slithering across the sidewalk and strangling whoever was in their way. I kept driving, and then I saw it. Long, thick ropes of pasta stretching across the asphalt and leading into one building. Spaghetti Teddy's. The pasta tendrils burst free from the building, and I swerved as they came for my car. I pressed hard on the gas and sped through what was left of the town, eventually making it out onto the highway. I stopped to get gas and decided to record this for anyone who wanted to know what happened to my town. There's nothing left, nothing from my life, nothing of my husband or my friends. I'm all alone, and it's all because of spaghetti teddies.